NXIVM, the now infamous sex cult, caught my attention in an HBO documentary due to the very obvious use of BDSM elements. But the more I watched, the more infuriated I became about the many lines that were blurred between healthy BDSM and abuse. So stay tuned, because by the end of this video, you will know exactly the tools of manipulation that were used and how to define what is healthy BDSM and abusive tactics used by sadistic sociopaths. But before we jump into why NXIVM is or is not BDSM, we must first establish the nature of some very key points, such as what is authentic consent and what is the relationship between BDSM and NXIVM. Now, NXIVM was pitched as a self-empowerment coaching program with many sub-programs underneath, such as ESP, Executive Success Program, SOP, Society of Protectors, and now the infamous DOS, Dominus, Obsequious, Sororium. Now, ESP focused on leadership skills and professional success, SOP was pitched as an empowerment community for men, and DOS was pitched as a powerful secret society for women. In reality, NXIVM, the mother company, and the most well-known name attached to the cult, was charged on these accounts: sex trafficking, child pornography, sexual exploitation of children, forced labor conspiracy, racketeering, and wire fraud conspiracy. I want you to think of BDSM as a tool like a knife is a tool. And if you're thinking, well, wait a minute, a knife is a weapon, no, that's just the context in which the knife can be used. A knife can also be used to carve a beautiful turkey dinner, but a knife can also, in the wrong hands, be used as a weapon of violence. Does it make the knife bad? No. It makes the person holding the knife and using it in that context bad. That's exactly what BDSM is, and that's exactly what happened in NXIVM and specifically in DOS. The tools of BDSM were used and taken into the wrong hands and used for the wrong purposes. And I can confidently say that these BDSM tools were used for the wrong purposes in the wrong context, because they completely violated the law that we have in BDSM. The law that we have in BDSM is structured or phrased in a variety of different ways. But one of the most popular ways of phrasing this law is S.S.C, safe, sane, consensual. And this means that every act that takes place within BDSM must be performed safely, sanely, and with the utmost consent. The problem that we have here with NXIVM is that this was not done safely. These tools were not wielded safely. These tools were not wielded with sanity and with total mindfulness involved. And these tools, although you did have quote-unquote consent, I'm going to prove to you how this consent was coerced and how coerced consent ceases to be consent. So the next question is, what is authentic consent and how does consent affect the relationship between BDSM and NXIVM? And this is a vital question to ask and a vital definition to provide, because the FBI chose to prosecute based on their definition of consent, which, thank goodness, seems very similar to mine. And my definition of consent, I believe, is the most accurate, mindful, and wise definition of consent I have heard. And call it bias, I don't really care. These 5 points of consent will keep you safe. Because here's the thing, consent, although our society often waters consent down, consent is not just having a choice, and consent is also not just the lack of no. Consent doesn't just mean, oh, well, they didn't say no, so therefore they said yes. That's not what consent is, and consent also does not mean the presence of choice. So here is my 5-point definition of consent. Consent is a completely mindful, willing, and uncoerced, catch that, uncoerced choice to say yes, and the ability to revoke that yes at any time without fear of repercussions. And for our purposes throughout this expose on NXIVM, SOP, and DOS, I'm going to be referring to all 5 points of consent as C1 through C5, as you can see on the screen. So C1 mindful, C2 willing, C3 uncoerced, etc. Now, since the majority of the abuses and cult-like BDSM activities were included in DOS, I want to start breaking that down. What is DOS? What happened to the women to get them involved and to keep them trapped? So DOS stands for Dominus Obsequious Sororium, or Dominant Submissive Sorority. And this dominant submissive sorority was sold as a secret women's empowerment society. Just like men have had secret societies throughout history, well, now it's your turn, ladies. But it was all lies. And I say it's all lies and not all about empowerment because the women, before getting any other information other than it's a super secret society and it's like a sisterhood and you're gonna love it, they had to submit not just collateral, extreme collateral. We're talking things that would make it very difficult for them to get work. It would destroy their relationships, things like that that have life-altering repercussions was demanded that these ladies provide before receiving any additional information. Okay? That not only violates 1 point in our 5 of consent, that violates 3 actually. We have C1, C4, and C5 violated here. But they would justify it through all of this insidious manipulation and twisting of the words. And the recruiter would say, well, if you really trusted yourself, if you trusted your word, if you trusted your commitment, you wouldn't be afraid. False, wrong. If anyone tells you that, they're full of shit. And run, 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 run. You are allowed to maintain your privacy. You're allowed to maintain your autonomy. And you are absolutely allowed to get your questions answered before committing to anything else. But do you see the twisted mindfuck here? It creates this argument that essentially the only way that you as a human being can trust what you say, trust your word, trust your commitments, is if you are afraid of repercussions. That's not accountability. That's manipulation. And that's a violation of consent. Because here's the thing. If you require collateral for obedience, you're not a dominant. You're an abuser who doesn't know how to win devotion. And because this pseudo-dom didn't know the first thing about winning devotion, these women were required to take a vow of obedience, a lifetime commitment, without knowing to what they were committing. Definitely a violation of C1 and C3. Now, the insidious part of this is the recruiters and even Keith phrased this vow as a vow to grow beyond your excuses, to challenge your fears. And if you really think about it, what that logic, what that does is create the argument internally within the victim that they feel a sense of shame and guilt for even wanting to set a boundary. And in BDSM terms, even wanting to call their safe word. The fact that you would even feel like this is too much and I want to put a stop to it, by that logic that was presented by Keith and the recruiters, those involved higher ranking in DOS, no. It creates a sense of shame within the victim, keeps them trapped. But as all pseudo-doms, this boy was a fake. And he was actually a failed businessman, just portraying himself as an enlightened guru and all of these wonderful things. He was actually a failed businessman, and he structured DOS as a pyramid scheme, just like his failed businesses. And in the structure of DOS, when you would own 6 slaves, you would then become a grand master. So you would recruit new girls under you because you wanted to be grandmaster. They would recruit girls under them because they wanted to be grandmaster. You see what I'm saying? Very much a very obvious pyramid scheme, but not for the girls involved, because every month that they were involved, they had to provide additional collateral. So we had to provide collateral to learn more information about it. And now every month that we're involved in this, we have to provide more extreme collateral, keeping the victims in this very fearful place and very controlled place and very abused place. None of this is consent. But I think the most striking thing and the element of this that really impacted a lot of vanillas was the initiation ceremony. Now, the initiation ceremony within DOS happened 6 weeks after you signed up. So essentially, after you've submitted about 3 forms of extreme collateral. Then we have an initiation ceremony. And the recruiters or your master or grandmaster would tell you, the slave in your DOS dynamic, that this is a mark of commitment, a mark of devotion, very small, just like a tattoo. But in order to proceed with the initiation ceremony, they had to do what? Provide more collateral. So after 6 weeks, the initiation ceremony would take place, and the women were told that they would receive a small mark like a tattoo. However, the women soon learned that this initiation ceremony was something else entirely. So now let's discuss the BDSM elements present in DOS and how these BDSM tools that should have been used in a healthy, empowering, loving context became tools of violence and coercion and torture, non-consensually, against these women. Let's break down where exactly that line occurred. Now, the first element here was honorifics. The ladies in DOS were required to be known as slave and to call their master, master. There was a very clear elements of power exchange through these honorifics. Now, I love honorifics. So honorifics by themselves, it's totally fine. In a healthy, loving, consensual BDSM context where everyone is abiding by safe, sane, consensual, and consent means all 5 points that I laid out earlier, honorifics are great. The problem here is that the honorifics happened after the collateral happened. And that is very crucial to understand, that the honorifics would not have happened without the collateral. Okay? If you want to call your partner daddy, mommy, master, whatever, because you genuinely feel that way about them and you want to express that, great. That's not the case here. The women were required to address their master this way. And as means of ensuring that that happened, as means of controlling them, they were provided with all of this collateral that they were afraid would get out. Not authentic choice. And as I said, the honorifics that were used in DOS confirmed the very clear power exchange dynamic. And again, the DS dynamic, the healthy DS dynamic, is the root foundation of every act that takes place within BDSM. Why was it abusive here? The collateral. Again, how was this presented? You are forced to be in this DS dynamic that's very new to you, that you don't really understand. It feels weird. You can't ask questions, but you have to abide by it. You have to go along with it. Why? Because you're scared. You've provided collateral to these people who are telling you that if you trusted your own word, you wouldn't really be afraid. So if you are afraid, that's instilling self-doubt. Do you see the insidious mind fuck here? This wasn't DS. This wasn't a power exchange dynamic. This was coerced consent driven by fear. And what have I been saying? Coerced consent ceases to be consent. Readiness drills were also involved in DOS, where the master would text their slave and the slave would have to respond immediately. As a dominant, I don't really see a problem with readiness drills, with training your submissive to be responsive and to be eager and to respond to you quickly and enthusiastically and make you a priority. I don't see a problem with that. However, where it crossed the line into abuse here in DOS was these readiness drills were used to justify sleep deprivation, where the master or Keith, their grandmaster, would call these readiness drills at all hours of the night. And so these women were being broken down psychologically, broken down physically through lack of sleep, and it was being painted as a readiness drill to make you stronger. No. Very, very twisted. So yes, readiness drills, great. Readiness drills used for the purpose of consciously, deliberately depriving your submissive of sleep, and therefore depriving them of health, depriving them from their ability to mentally, cognitively process things. No, we're now crossing a line where we're violating your mindfulness and we're violating your sanity. Safe, sane, consensual. And what was one of our definitions of consent? A completely mindful choice. If you have not been able to sleep, not been able to rest, and you're delirious, hallucinating, confused, whatever, you cannot make a mindful choice. And that is where it crossed the line. Now, this is where things really started to go downhill with some extreme behavior modification. Now, in BDSM, we have slave training, we have submissive training, and we also have behavior modification. I can break down how I define the differences later if you are interested, but for today's purposes, behavior modification is essentially taking things in someone's personality and adjusting them, changing them. So in BDSM, I look at it as a little bit different, a little bit deeper than just submissive training or slave training. With that being said, if you as a dominant are going to be participating in behavior modification with your submissive, that has to be something that your submissive initiates. Master, sir, mommy, goddess, whatever, I see that you excel in this area and I don't. I have something in my personality and my behavior, whatever, that I don't excel in this area. Could you help me work that out of myself? That's acceptable because that is completely mindful, willing, uncoerced choice to say yes and the ability to revoke that yes at any time without fear of repercussions. We are checking off consent on that if your submissive comes to you for that. But if this is, you're breaking someone down to the point where they have no worth, they have no value, they're scared to set boundaries because they're afraid of being interpreted as weak, and then you tell them there are all these fucked up things wrong with you, then we get into an abusive line. And Keith very much did that as the Grandmaster and as through the other masters involved in DOS. There were extreme forms of behavior modification that I would never subject a submissive to, because this was not behavior modification for the purpose of benefiting the submissive in a way that the submissive desires. This was behavior modification as a form of abuse and control. For instance, in addition to the sleep deprivation, the ladies were under extreme calorie restrictions to the point where they had to request every single calorie from their master. Again, if you are a submissive and you want your dominant to monitor your diet, to control your diet, that's fine. I've done that for submissives before because they were eating horribly and going to eat themselves into an early death. And so they, again, asked for my participation, and it was I'm going to monitor your calories, monitor your macronutrients, micronutrients, whatever, to get you to a healthy place. Okay? The way it was used in DOS, it was extreme calorie restriction to the point where Keith actually said to the ladies, as long as you're still having your period, you're fine. That is beyond. This was not being done for the purposes of giving their submissives health. This was to wear down the mind, to wear down the body, and to inflict extreme levels of control. And this one just gets under my skin, the daily fail form. After the readiness drills and the sleep deprivation and requesting every calorie, etc. These ladies were just beat down, beat down, beat down at every turn, and every day they had to submit a daily fail form, evaluating their day not through what they accomplished, but through every possible little thing they could have done wrong. It's sick. It's sick. And so every day they were evaluating themselves and they were beating themselves down and calling it empowerment and calling it growth and calling it self-improvement. Do you see the twisted, insidious mindfuck that happened? This was abusive. This was not a BDSM element. This was straight up control freak abuse. There were also high levels of penance and punishment involved in DOS, where the ladies, even if they weren't masochistic, even if they weren't into a severe paddling, were afraid of stepping out of line because that was a threat that they would be severely paddled by Keith, the Grand Master. And so there was all this fear of punishment, okay? Now, we use elements of penance, punishment, reward system in BDSM, especially when you're training a new sub, even just to give them treats and benefits, okay? It's a very effective system at training and consensual behavior modification. That's why I was saying earlier, it's a tool. BDSM is a tool. You can use it to carve a turkey or you can use it to kill someone, okay? As a knife, you can use it to carve a turkey or kill someone. BDSM is the same thing. This tool got taken out of context. And I'll talk about that in just a few minutes as we get to the coercion. How was he able to get away with all of this shit, right? You might be watching this going, I would never agree to that. I would never. The things that you are saying, I would never agree to. No. I would see it coming from a mile away and I would never agree to it. Well, these ladies weren't idiots. We had a lot of high-powered ladies in this group. We had a lot of alpha females, a lot of really wealthy, successful women. So this wasn't about being smart enough to be duped or not. There were insidious levels of coercion. And remember when I referred to the physical signs of ownership that were also included in DOS? This is a wonderful thing that we do in BDSM when our submissive wants to wear our collar or wants to have a tattoo or even a brand for the very masochistic submissives among us. And so wearing a uniform, wearing a collar, wearing things like that that demonstrate that you are owned can be really, really deep, lovely, beautiful, and intimate. The problem is, in DOS, the ladies were wearing a belly chain to show their sign of devotion. But again, all of this was devotion, not based off of devotion. It wasn't really devotion. It was fear and coercion. And coerced consent ceases to be consent. Okay? But they took it a step further in DOS, in the initiation ceremony. This small mark, like a tattoo that I mentioned earlier, was anything but. Okay? And it's gonna get really intense here. So just, if this might trigger warning, we're gonna get into some heavy shit right now. Okay? What actually happened to these women for the initiation ceremony after 6 weeks? Okay? The women were gathered together, blindfolded, stripped naked, driven to an unknown location, and coerced into saying, "Master, would you brand me? It would be an honor." And why I say they were coerced into saying that, we're going to talk about literally how the FBI has recorded evidence of Keith scripting what they should say so it wouldn't sound coerced, okay? So this was all staged, all coerced. And again, remember, these girls that are doing this, these ladies who are doing this, they've got all this collateral. Naked photos, shit on their families, stuff that would incriminate them in their career, whatever. And if they don't go through with this, all that gets released. all of that gets destroyed. This is not BDSM. This is not a submissive out of all of their love and all of their devotion and all of their desire on their knees begging to wear your mark. And then you as the dominant vetting them and, hey, are you sure you know what you're signing up for? It's not that. This is something completely insidious, completely abusive, and completely non-consensual. So that's the point I want you to really think about as we close this section out. Willingness on its own does not indicate consent. That's why we have 4 other points in our definition of consent. If someone is willing to do something, that doesn't tell me they have consent. Why are they willing to do it? And that's the thing. When we look at why were these women willing to get branded, these ladies were more afraid of what would happen if they said no than what would happen when they said yes. DOS relies on coercion instead of open dialogue, on intimidation instead of free choice. Degradation and violence toward women are being justified and put into espion terms that make them seem okay. These quotes by former NXIVM members reveal the depths of Keith's insidious manipulation that I, for this video, am calling the coercion. And there were many things that he did. Please, if you're interested in this, go and watch the HBO documentary because we just do not have time to fill in all of the details today. But I am going to give you what I saw to be the 3 most predominant lies that allowed this mental and emotional coercion to take place. When I asked the question in the last segment, how would you ever allow yourself to go through these things? How would you ever allow yourself to be branded if you didn't want to be branded? This is how he did it. It was gradual, it was very sneaky, very insidious, and there were 3 main lies that really got into the participant's psyche. The first lie I identified is that emotions make you weak and put you at a disadvantage. Now, this line of thinking is very sociopathic, and actually Keith Raniere was very sadistic and very sociopathic in his mentality, and it actually took a lot of principles from Scientology, which is very abusive in of its own. So we have a lot of sadistic, sociopathic reasoning behind this lie that emotions make you inherently weak and put you at a disadvantage. That's not true. Emotions don't make you weak. Your inability to control and communicate those emotions puts you at a disadvantage. When you don't have the emotional intelligence to recognize your own emotions, see when they're controlling you, and get that control over your emotions back, yes, you are going to be at a disadvantage. Yes, you are susceptible to being manipulated. However, it's not the presence of emotions that are doing it. We're humans. We have emotions. We're not robots. So essentially, Keith Raniere argued that intellectual superiority could be obtained through emotional detachment versus emotional integration and vocabulary. Now, what kind of logic does this produce in the mind and heart of the victim? A built-in justification system. If emotions make you weak, make you inferior, make you pathetic, put you at a disadvantage, if that's what the abuser is telling you, then what are you going to do as the victim? You're going to justify your emotions. You're going to excuse your emotions. You're going to minimize your emotions. When something hits your radar that you would normally address and create a boundary, that makes you weak. You're being emotional. So it actually gets the victim to justify the abuse as they stay in it. That is our biggest coercion lie, number 1. Even Mark Vicente, who was very high up in ESP NXIVM, when he left, he explained that you are afraid to ask questions because you don't want to seem dishonorable. You don't want to seem too emotional, too frantic, too out of control, dishonorable, questioning, etc. So you don't ask questions and you just justify everything that happens to you. And if you have a fear, if you have an insecurity, if you have a bad emotion, it's not valid. It's weakness that you need to push through. The second biggest coercion lie is you are weak of mind and character if you do not always follow through on your commitments. Now, the sneaky thing here is Keith would coerce these ladies, especially in DOS, to commit without knowing what they were committing to. And then beyond that, he would solidify the commitment by requiring collateral. Okay, how many times do I have to say this? Coerced consent ceases to be consent. So what does this lie do? If you, a victim, are being fed this lie that you are mentally weak, that you're emotionally weak, that you're weak of character, that you're weak as a human being, if you don't totally follow through with your commitments, and then we trick you into commitments that you don't like, you don't feel safe with, you don't feel comfortable with, are way abusive, way too invasive, what happens? You, as the victim, will accept it, will accept the mistreatment, will accept the abuse, and actually think that you are being weak by wanting it to end. That is one of the biggest lies that keeps victims trapped in abuse, is the predator will drill into the victim how weak and pathetic you are, weak and pathetic, and you need help, and you need strength, and you need growth. And as justification to do that, to push you past all of these limits, to totally violate your boundaries, you look at it as, I need to be better, I need to be stronger. So again, this in a BDSM context would make the victim, would make the submissive feel guilty and ashamed for even wanting to call their safe word, for even wanting to set boundaries and limits with their dominant. Do you see how fucked up that is? This is abuse through and through, and it was accomplished through coercion. And Keith actually had the audacity to phrase it this way. He said, shame is when you don't want to be associated with something and you fearfully run away from it. Think about how twisted that is. He defines shame as when you reach something or introduce something that you don't like, you have a boundary, you have a limit, and shame is when you set that boundary. Shame is when you set that limit. He doesn't see it as boundary setting, as autonomy. That is how twisted this was. And so these ladies were being fed these lies for years and years and years. And then we add collateral to it, where they're scared of their nudes being leaked, or their bad information about their family or past experiences, or things that would incriminate their job or ability to make money, etc. Trapped. That is not consent. Being trapped is not consent. And the final coercion lie is you cannot trust your own judgment or ability to make healthy choices. Now, if a submissive comes to a dominant and says, I would like your help to grow, I would like your help to make better choices, I would like your help to be more disciplined, wonderful. As long as they're coming to the dominant with all 5 facets of consent, okay? Mindful, willing, uncoerced, ability to revoke that, yes, without fear of repercussions, okay? That's not what happened here. This was a deep level of minimization that was taking place in the hearts and the minds of the women. If the lie that they are being fed is they cannot trust their own judgment, they cannot trust their own ability to make choices, you will always be afraid of yourself. Think about that. You will always be afraid of yourself and ashamed of your potential. Not encouraged or excited by your potential, but ashamed. And Keith Raniere phrased it like this: commitment requires collateral. And even when the DOS ladies were being recruited for DOS, that's something the recruiter would tell them as well. When the topic of collateral was breached is if you really trusted yourself, if you trusted your commitments, you wouldn't be scared. The thing is, they should have been, because this was a coercive, highly manipulative, highly coercive move. And essentially, this lie created the rationale within the heart and mind of their victim that the only way that it's possible for you to be faithful to your word is if you're afraid of repercussions. And this leaves the victim in a highly controlled state, not by choice, but out of fear, which is a C5 violation. So really, these 3 lies were propagated throughout many years in a very slow and sneaky process to coerce the victims into really justifying their own abuse, excusing the abuse, justifying the abuse, and seeing how much they could take to prove their strength. And that is the most twisted part. If you actually evaluate all of the BDSM elements, they were initiated and maintained by fear and collateral alone. No authentic desire, no authentic consent. And that's the thing. I said it before and I will say it again. If you require collateral for obedience, you are an abuser, not a dominant, who does not know the first thing about winning devotion. And that's the key to healthy BDSM. For BDSM to be safe, sane, consensual, we have to have all 5 points of consent. Not just willing, because consent is not just willingness, and consent is not just a lack of no. And now we know that any coerced consent ceases to be consent. So that's what separates abusive acts and BDSM acts. Is it safe? Is it sane? And is it done with our 5 points of consent? And if we put NXIVM, SOP, and DOS through that test, it fails every time.